Talking about affirmative action often makes for a tricky conversation. So tricky, in fact, that today the Supreme Court effectively decided not to make a decision at all in the controversial case of Fisher versus the University of Texas. They sent the case back down to an appeals court for further review. And many people are now asking what the future of affirmative action will look like when it comes to university admissions. Will schools move from a race-based system of preferences towards something focused more on class? And is that the right thing to do? Joining us to talk about the future of public university admissions, we've got Cheryl Ching. She authored a recent report for USC's Center for Urban Education called Why Race?, focused on achieving equity and racial and ethnic representation on college campuses. Hallie Potter is a policy associate at the Century Foundation. Dominic Jones is a recent law school grad who attended oral arguments in the Supreme Court case of Fisher versus University of Texas. And Ryan Riley, our HuffPost Justice reporter, who's been covering the latest developments in this case. So hello, everyone. Thanks for joining me today.
Hi.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Ryan, why don't we start with you so maybe you can just break down some of the basic details here for some people that might not be entirely familiar with the Fisher case and what today's decision really was.
Sure. So essentially, first it kicked it down to the appeals court, but really the crux of it was that it allows it instructed courts to take a sort of a skeptical look at the actual makeup of these affirmative action programs and see whether there are any alternative race neutral alternatives, I guess, that could be used to achieve racial diversity that wouldn't rely on race as a consideration. So it does require these courts, and will essentially set off probably a lot of separate challenges in the future to a lot of different individual, especially public university policies when it comes to programs that are designed to achieve more racial diversity.
And so, what they did here is they chose, like we said, not to make a decision. They punted it back down to the lower court. But, just in terms of reading some of the opinions from the justices here, do you get the feeling that in the future affirmative action is still a policy that's under a lot of threat?
Well, certainly we have a case coming up on affirmative action next term. And one of the things that, in retrospect, you can see is that when the court decided to accept that case, they may have realized that at least the conservative justices on the court may have realized that they wouldn't be able to get sort of maybe a more sweeping ruling that they were expecting in this individual case. So that's why they took up that case that we'll be hearing next term. So perhaps a year out from now, this whole conversation will be more mute, and we will have more of a sweeping decision when it comes to affirmative action.
Now, Dominic, this is something that interests you so much that as a law student, you actually slept outside the Supreme Court in order to be able to attend the oral arguments. So why did you do that? Why was this case so important to you?
Well, I mean, just from a practical standpoint, the foundational case for Fisher was obviously the Grutter case, and it involved admissions at the University of Michigan Law School. And being in law school at the time, I felt that, I was much too young to see Grutter when it first came out. So a group of friends and I thought that, we're in DC, we're in law school. It's really not a choice for us. So we made the effort to take out our yoga mats and sleep out there overnight so we could get our tickets to see the oral argument. So it was a fun experience and really thought-provoking and interesting to see the justices in action as they question the lawyers in that case.
And so, what do you make of today's decision? What do you make of some of the things that we're hearing? I mean, if you take Clarence Thomas, for example, he is the only African-American Supreme Court justice who's currently sitting on the bench, and yet he is someone who has been pretty staunchly anti-affirmative action. Just recently he compared it to slavery and to segregation, in his opinion, and said that he's not even sure if there is any value to increasing diversity on college campuses.
Well, Justice Clarence Thomas's views on affirmative action are pretty well known amongst law school students and African Americans, and I think they're a unique byproduct of his upbringing, which was from my home state of Georgia, but he's from rural Georgia, and I think in many of his comments that he's given in the media that he feels somehow that when he went to Yale Law School, he was looked down upon. He got the feeling that individuals thought he was only there because of affirmative action. So I think Justice Thomas carries a bit of a chip on his shoulder that I think informs his views on affirmative action, for lack of a better term. His views are interesting. Let's say that. I think the vast majority of African Americans understand that the history of race and racism in the United States is something that must be faced head on. And one way to do that, and one way to give historically discriminated against minorities opportunities in higher education is through affirmative action policies, and that these policies are not only necessary but crucial in remedying past discrimination.
And so, I mean, the viewpoint that we often hear from those that are opposed to affirmative action as a policy, or from some of the conservative justices on the court, is they'd prefer race-neutral policies, is something that they like to call it. Whether something like that can even exist, I think, is part of the debate. But Cheryl, let me go to you. You have a study here that you authored for the Center for Urban Education, saying why race, understanding the importance of foregrounding race and ethnicity, and achieving equity on college campuses. Tell us a little bit about what it is that you found and what you want to argue as to whether or not you think that affirmative action based on race is something that we still need in this country, or whether we should start stepping more in terms of a direction that focuses on class, on socioeconomic status.
Okay, so I guess it might be easiest to talk about. The report came out of a concern. So the Center for Urban Education works with, I guess by this point, about over 80 campuses across the nation. And really, it's to look at student outcomes and to see where there might be inequities, like across various student groups that are racially defined. And one of the questions that comes up a lot is, why should we focus on race? Why not focus on class or income or socioeconomic status? And at least at the center, what we do believe is that, like what Dominic had said, there are these historical and structural forces that still create racial inequities over time. And I think the real position is that unless we focus on it specifically, these inequities won't ever shrink over time. So that's really the impulse behind the report. And one of the interesting things I found, probably one of the most surprising things, was actually it came out of the work of Carnevale and Stroll, who I think was they were working with the Century Foundation at the time. And they looked specifically at outcomes for SAT and I think they were sort of looking at measures of disadvantage and how those look over SES and over race. And one of the conclusions they came to is that these things have to be taken into account together, because they interact in ways that create levels of disadvantage that SES alone or race alone don't actually capture. So I think for those reasons, I think we always need to keep race at the foreground of our minds. And when looking at affirmative action, to erase it completely and to move towards a race-neutral or class-based system, it's unclear to me whether the outcomes that we want to see on college campuses, and assuming that these are outcomes we share in terms of diversity, whether it's racial as well as economic, will be achieved without looking at both of those things in conjunction with each other.
And I think, one of the questions that people often ask is what are the outcomes, as you said, that people really want to see on college campuses? What are the goals that they want to see? Some people will say that even with affirmative action policies in place, the socioeconomic factor is still very strong, that for the most part, these are middle class or upper income students. And, even minorities do not benefit from affirmative action if they also are in the very lower rungs of the income population. And so, Cheryl, do you think that the people need to focus more on class rather than race? I meant to go to Hallie, actually, because I think you made your stance pretty clear there, Cheryl. My apologies.
I'm glad that Cheryl brought up Century Foundation research on that topic, because I agree that it really bears strongly to this point, but I read it a little bit differently. So I'm really glad that the Supreme Court has left open a door for race-based affirmative action, and I think that there's a strong role for that. But I think that socioeconomic affirmative action is really important on top of that. And what you see in our country is that the socioeconomic achievement gap is much greater than the racial achievement gap. So the Century Foundation research that Cheryl was talking about looked at the disadvantage in SAT scores associated with a number of different factors. And if you looked just at the factor associated with being Black, there was a 56-point disadvantage. But if you added up all of these other factors that were socioeconomic, so family income, but also parents' educational backgrounds and the level of poverty of a neighborhood, you came up with 399 points. So there's a really big area of disadvantage that's covered under socioeconomic achievement gap. And you see sort of similar research from Sean Reardon at Stanford University, who found that over the past 50 years, the racial achievement gap has really declined, whereas the income gap has grown. And so you see this flip from, instead of having a larger racial achievement gap, we now have an income gap that's twice the size of the race-based achievement gap. So for that reason, I think it's really important that colleges, even when they have race-based affirmative action, turn also to socioeconomic plans to capture some of those factors that aren't in a pure race plan.
Well, so I'm curious to hear from all of you on that. On one hand, we know that the wealth gap within the United States is rising, and it is dramatically, especially if you look at some of the recent figures and numbers out there. And so it's clearly something that's becoming a huge societal problem. But is there a way to fuse this all together, to be able to focus on race and class? I mean, we already have financial aid policies that are in place for certain students, that can take advantage of them to try to get an education. And so is it just that those policies that we have in place are failing? Who wants to go first?
Well, if I can jump in and say, I think financial aid is a big part of making sure that socioeconomically disadvantaged students apply because they know they're going to be welcome, and also making sure that they're successful while they're there. But that's only part of an affirmative action plan, is getting students to apply and supporting them while they're in. The other part is taking account for the disadvantages that students have faced up to that point. And so students coming from lower socioeconomic backgrounds don't have the parent support, often are in schools that are under-resourced. And so it takes sort of a similar amount of effort maybe to get to a lower academic place than students who are coming with a lot of resources associated with being middle and upper middle class. And another thing that I would add about socioeconomic affirmative action that I think is really powerful is that it can capture a lot of the effects of race-based discrimination. So some parts of racial discrimination have socioeconomic manifestations. So like if you look at housing discrimination, Black families who are earning $75,000 a year live in neighborhoods that have as much poverty as white families earning only $40,000 a year. So I completely agree with Cheryl that there is something going on here that has to do with race and discrimination that we need to address. But if you have a sophisticated socioeconomic affirmative action plan, you can look at applicants and say, well, yeah, their family made $75,000 this year, but look at the neighborhood that they're living in. They don't have the same resources in terms of schools and libraries and other support services that students of similar incomes, but in wealthier neighborhoods, might have.
I was wondering if I just wanted to add to that. I think you're absolutely right, Haley, and I think you're right in that SES does capture a lot of that effect of race, and I think it does come out of that interaction between these two categories, which they're not mutually exclusive. I mean, they're in single individuals. But I suppose where I get tripped up a lot, and when I think about the work that we do at CUE, and it's working at sort of institutional responses, it's like, what would a sophisticated SES affirmative action plan really look like? And I think a lot about the experience of the UCs, where after 1996, they were told that they can't use race in any form of consideration, whether it's in admissions or in hiring. So none of the public sector could use it. But how long has it been? It's been more than 15 years, and they're still struggling to get to that level of diversity, even using what I think are actually pretty successful, or not pretty sophisticated ways of looking at holistic admission and taking into account, where a student went to high school and, whether they have access to AP courses and all of these things, which all seem to be elements that would go into an SES-based affirmative action. And yet the results are still what they are, that you have the chancellor saying that we would like to go back to a pre-Prop 209 era. So, I'm sort of caught in this in-between of trying to sort out, and we can't ever foretell what these outcomes will look like. I feel like we're arguing, just are dancing around like a point where we would probably agree, and that we need to take both of these things into account. And it's like, which one do you foreground over the other? And I certainly wouldn't argue to get rid of SES or to get rid of race. I think they both need to be considered. And it's in what balance, I suppose, is really the question.
Well, so why do you guys think then, Dominic, that this is something that really strikes such a chord, with the American population? Recently we saw some polls from the LA Times and from Newsweek. They found that Americans oppose racial preferences in college admissions by 2-1, but they favor income preferences by the same margin. And, actually there was also a really interesting piece in the New Yorker that was looking at, they say the biggest scandal in college admissions from the meritocratic point of view is the preference given to varsity athletes, and inequity by the standards of academic merit that has been thoroughly documented and that involves a far greater number of admitted students every year than affirmative action policies do. But everyone's so cool with that, right? Because everybody loves college sports. Why is it when it comes down to race-based affirmative action, this is something that is so divisive within our culture?
Well, just from a pragmatic standpoint, I think race has always been a hot button issue in the United States, and we have the Equal Protection Clause for a reason, because there was an entire segment of the population that for many hundreds of years was discriminated against, not because they were poor, not because they lived in bad neighborhoods, but because they were of a different race. They didn't have the same rights. They couldn't drink from the same drinking fountains. They couldn't eat at the same lunch counters. So I think race has always been in the looming over like impending doom with regard to race relations in the United States. But I think that you make a good point when you talk about other preferences that are given to students that have absolutely nothing to do with their potential to be great students. You gave the example of the preferences given to athletes in universities across this country. I think about legacy clauses that are still in existence in many institutions across this country. No one seems to have a problem if someone can get into a Harvard or a Yale because their father or grandfather went to that school. But it just boggles my mind that they don't extend the logic that they use for race-based affirmative action to legacy-based preferences for students, because it's merely the accident of birth. Whether someone's father went to a school has absolutely nothing to do with their academic achievement or anything like that. So I think, to go back to Cheryl's main point, I think a holistic approach is the approach that's really best to really tackle the issues that are at play in all these cases, is that you take into account race, you take into account someone's background, their high school, whether or not they had access to AP courses, or if they played the cello, or if they traveled extensively. This holistic approach is the approach that was specifically upheld in the Grutter case, and it's one that's still good law. As I read the opinion that came out today, Grutter is still good law. So take the holistic approach. Race is just, as some of the justices have said, a factor of a factor of a factor of a factor. And it's just something that makes an individual unique, just like knowing a second or third language or being from rural Kansas. It's just one aspect that makes an individual a unique individual and able to bring that uniqueness to the academic environment.
Ryan, do you think that race is something that still, politically people are very scared of, though? I mean, a lot of people have looked to President Obama on this particular case, and, and he hasn't really weighed in, but we've heard him say in the past that he doesn't think that his two daughters, Sasha and Malia, should have any type of preference when it comes to college admissions. Politically, how do you think that people really have been looking at his role? The role that, as much as he has been playing it, or how much they think that he should be playing a role here?
Right. I think, socioeconomic factors taken into consideration for admission are a lot less controversial than a strictly racial analysis. And, I think that you also have, because of, I think, a lot of people typically have thought of affirmative action applying to African Americans, but, it's also been applying to Hispanics and Latinos. So I think that, I think generally it is a kind of a controversial thing still, obviously, as a sort of the fallout from this opinion has shown. But I think that less controversial, and probably as we see a shift more to perhaps more socioeconomic based criteria, I think that will it'll be interesting to see what sort of what the political fallout from that exactly is, whether or not that is, as the impact of that happens over the long term, whether you have people in higher socioeconomic situations who are upset about preferences being given to those who perhaps weren't under such circumstances. And certainly, I think, to an earlier point about the issue with legacy, that's also something we don't hear necessarily a lot about. Now, that might be a little bit because we're focused here on public universities rather than private universities, and as far as this particular decision. But it'll be an interesting debate to see how it plays out over the next few years.
I mean, Cheryl, do you think that we'll ever get to the point there? Clearly, we are not in a post-race society, right? Which is something that people try to claim at times. But do you think that we'll ever get to the point where there won't be the need for these types of policies? And even if you look at just demographic shifts, what we're seeing from the latest census results, I mean, we know that the makeup of the demographics of the United States are completely changing, right? I mean, white babies are now in the minority in this country.
I mean, I think it sort of goes back to just institutional practices, because if at the end of the day, the pipeline to, let's say the most selective, and really what we're talking about here is like the most selective of the institutions, the most select, like the flagship universities, and among those, like the Michigans, the Berkeleys, the Austins, which are basically like public Ivies. I mean, if the pipeline into that is still fairly, and it's so competitive that it could still be fairly homogenous, then yes, we always need to take race into account, even with the demographic shifts like going the way that they are. I mean, I think we need to take into account all the kind of stratifications that happen, like from K to 12 into higher education, so that until those things start to equalize, and until students who go into K to 12 get the same kinds of opportunities across the country. Like, it will never be this kind of level playing field, like even if the demographic shifts are happening. Like, they might move things, like I think one way or the other, but there still is that kind of inherent structure that is working against folks who are, who together are low income and minority. So for me, I mean, again, I don't have a crystal ball, I can't really tell, but I'm not optimistic that without a consideration of race, an explicit consideration of race, which, as Dominic has pointed out, is like a factor of a factor of a factor. We're not even talking about quotas here. We're talking about one of many to be considered. If that goes away, I feel like we're just going to lose a whole lot of ground. I mean, things are already so narrowly tailored, and that's what we're fighting over, is like just that little bit of ground that's left. So for me, I mean, personally, and I think it's also sort of the opinion of the center that I work at, I mean, to take race off the table would have fairly dire consequences, like moving forward.
And Dominic, what do you think about that? I mean, some people are convinced that this is a conservative Supreme Court here, and you have a lot of cases that are coming up that really are trying to dismantle, I mean, if you want to look at the Voting Rights Act, if you want to look at a number of other cases that are coming up too, just years and years of civil rights successes.
Well, I think I don't necessarily think that this court is actively seeking to dismantle the progress that this country has made with regard to civil rights. I had a law school professor who actually worked for the late, great Senator Ted Kennedy, and he said Senator Kennedy would always say that civil rights is the unfinished business of the 20th century. And I think that we had a lot of mechanisms in place that were passed in a really great generation of ours, and that's the civil rights generation. And I think that these things are still needed today because, I mean, whether it's the legacy of segregation or it's resegregation in places that didn't have segregation back in the 1960s, there's so many mechanisms that are implemented in our law right now. And I think that the Supreme Court should, I think, really fulfill its role and really look with great emphasis to the Equal Protection Clause and the spirit behind the 14th Amendment and the other Reconstruction amendments, and see that they were designed in essence to remedy this terrible history of discrimination in this country. And merely because we have a Black president, or merely because more avenues are open to minorities, that the work is not yet done. So will there come a day where we won't need it? I sure hope so. Will it be in any of our lifetimes? I mean, who knows? I know many of, an older generation of African Americans who thought they'd never see an African American president while they were still living, and we have that. But it's merely a road sign on the way to the eventual finish line. It's not the finish line itself. And I think it's in trying to reach these goals and trying to reach the point where everyone is given an equal and fair chance, and everyone gets that equal opportunity that was promised to us. That's the real goal here.
Hallie, I'm going to give you the final word here, and then we have to wrap it up. And so, I mean, you know, what do you say here? I mean, clearly there are, we have inequities in our education system that start at a very young age. And, you know, this is something that the president has focused on, too, is just fixing education in general, making sure that everyone has access to, to a pre-K education. We do have a wealth gap that's increasing. We have shifting demographics. But if you can't, these are not things that are all solvable overnight, very clearly so. And maybe we won't ever fully eradicate poverty or some of these differences. And so do we need to keep policies like this in place?
I think we absolutely do. And I think that the key here in terms of looking towards the future is seeing, I think we have a court that was very clear that this is still not a safe area. This is a contentious decision that took a lot of months to write. And so in moving forward, I think colleges really need to think about broadening their plans and building socioeconomic plans that go along with any race-based plans that they might have. Then the court has said that in order to prove that you need a race-based plan, the burden's now going to be on universities to show that they have looked at specific race-neutral alternatives and that they won't work. So if that's the standard that's going to be held, then colleges might as well explore those now, because not only would they be needed to support any race-based plan, but they have their own merits, and we're always going to have some kind of income gap in our country. And I think that's part of what colleges and public institutions can do, is to serve the role of helping to fight that gap and helping to have some kind of economic mobility across generations by making up for some of those disadvantages that people have growing up in the home.
All right. Well, as we said, I think this is a debate that, that we'll be having for a long time to come. And Ryan, as you mentioned, the Supreme Court will be taking another look at it next fall, and perhaps, something that could have more broad sweeping ramifications there. So in the meantime, I want to thank you all so much for joining me, Cheryl, Hallie, Dominic, and Ryan.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right, guys, stick around. There's a lot more coming up on HuffPost Live.